In our last video, we engine swapped this Kraton EXB, and while this thing looks absolutely awesome, I think you'll agree the performance of this engine in this particular truck was just a little bit tame. Today, we're gonna make some modifications to this engine that hopefully spice it up, and if that doesn't work, we've got something really spicy to put in. The last thing we did in the previous video was convert this from nitro to gas. We're gonna be pulling all of this back out of here and converting it back over to glow plug ignition, but first, I'm actually really curious to see how the spark ignition works with nitro fuel. I've read online that this does technically work, and I'm really curious to see what the results are, so let's see what happens. Then when we come back, we're gonna tear this engine apart and fix a few of the deficiencies I found when we built it. All right, she's full of nitro fuel. Let's see what it does. Well, it started awfully easy. Does it run okay? That does actually seem to run better than on the glow plug. It's not any faster though. It definitely is running, that's pretty cool. I'd say it has a lot less power than on the glow plugs though. What exactly do I mean by that? What's the difference between spark ignition and glow ignition? In any engine, there needs to be a source of ignition in order to turn the potential energy in the fuel into kinetic energy that actually drives whatever you're trying to move. Most gasoline engines use what's known as a spark ignition, where they have a high voltage pulse going through wires through a spark plug, which has a small gap in the end, and that spark is what actually ignites the fuel-air mixture. Most small RC model engines use what are known as glow plugs, and instead of having a spark, you have this filament that stays hot and glows, and that's what ignites the fuel-air mixture. This is actually a really interesting system. That little wire has a platinum coating on it, and that platinum coating actually catalytically reacts with the methanol in the nitromethane fuel. And unlike the spark of a spark plug, it's that glowing coil that actually lights the fuel off on each combustion cycle. The main benefit to a glow plug system is simplicity. Unlike with a spark-based ignition where you need some kind of high-energy discharge system, a sensor to tell the engine when to actually fire that system, and a bunch of other supporting parts, with a glow plug ignition you pretty much just need the glow plug and then the fuel to actually keep the glow plug glowing. The main reason we're going to be switching back from gasoline to nitro fuel is that nitro fuel has the ability to produce a lot more power than gasoline does. This isn't because nitro fuel is more energy dense than gasoline. As a matter of fact, gasoline is a little bit more energy dense by weight than nitromethane is. The main advantage nitromethane has is the ability for it to run a lot more fuel for a given amount of air. The perfect air ratio for gasoline is about 14 parts of air to 1 part of gasoline, and the perfect ratio of nitromethane fuel is about 2 parts air, which makes a huge difference in how much actual fuel you can shove into the engine. Speaking of shoving fuel into the engine, I think one of the big problems we have is the restriction of this intake manifold. The carburetor lets fuel and air in here. It has to run down to these holes and then into the engine. I think we can make a big improvement here by simply cutting the middle of this spacer and this gasket out. Let me do that and I'll show you what I mean. As you can see, with that small modification, the actual manifold part of this intake is going to be quite a bit larger, and that should allow a lot more airflow, and I think that's going to give us more power, especially on the top end, but we've got a few other things we can try to hopefully make that even better. I noticed when I was originally building this engine that those valves I showed you didn't really seal that well, and I think if we make that valve interface a little bit better, we can get better compression, which again, should give us more power. Pulling the engine apart is also going to give us the opportunity to inspect everything and make sure nothing has broken or come loose. Everything in here looks pretty good. As you can see, the top end of the engine is actually lubricated by grease. The bottom end of the engine is lubricated by oil in the fuel, and I think that's another place where we're going to be losing some power. I'll talk about that in just a minute though. In most typical four-stroke engines, valves open and close to allow fresh air and fuel in and combustion gases out. I noticed when I was putting this together that these valves don't seal very well, and I'm hoping that making them seal better will give us higher compression and therefore more power. Of course, since everything in here is lubricated with grease, everything's super greasy, so we're gonna have to wipe a bunch of this off, but I do think this is gonna be worthwhile, as any combustion gases that leak out not only reduce power, but they also cause problems, especially if you've got combustion gases pushing out of the intake manifold. That can cause all kinds of weird problems. These valves are held in with little circlips, and there are actually springs underneath them. I'm gonna remove this off camera so I don't lose anything. Now with that removed, you can see the teeny tiny valve that actually controls inlet and outlet into the combustion chamber. lever. And to lap these valves in, I'm actually going to use toothpaste. Surprisingly, toothpaste does have some abrasive in it, and for something as soft as this brass, it should work just fine. All I'm going to do is put just a little bit of toothpaste on the valve itself, stick it back in the head, nice and minty fresh. Then I'm going to put a piece of fuel tube on the back. That's going to allow me to spin the valve while pulling on it, and I'm going to keep doing that until we get a really nice mating surface between it and the valve seat. There we go, guys. That actually looks really nice. Now, you obviously wouldn't be able to use toothpaste on a full-size engine because the valve seats are going to be a lot harder, but on something like this, it should be fine. And again, I'm hoping that's going to give us just a bit more power out of this engine. I'm going to go ahead and get the rest of these done, get all this cleaned up, put fresh grease in it, put it back together, and let's go find out. Okay, guys, we've got more air going in. We've got more air staying in. Can we make more air come out? The answer to that is absolutely, but I'm probably not going to. I don't think it would make a big difference, but what we could do is make a 2-to-1 exhaust system. And essentially with that, the exhaust pulse from one cylinder will help draw out the exhaust pulse from the other cylinder. In a pretty inefficient engine like this, I really don't think it would make a huge difference, so it's not something I'm going to mess with right now. But if this thing runs great now and we just need a tiny bit more power, it's definitely something we can look at. Of course, if it doesn't and we need a lot more power, we're going to be looking at this. One of the reasons I think we see a big loss of efficiency is the design of the lower lubricating system. The design of this engine means it depends on oil from the fuel to lubricate everything in the bottom end, which means by design, this thing relies on compression blow-by, and compression blow-by means less power. Unfortunately, there's nothing we can do about that because the bottom end does need to be lubricated. Now, speaking of power, let's go ahead and get this thing filled up with fuel and see if we can make any more. Yeah, I actually think they did. This thing sounds meaner, and it's actually got more power. I'm kind of surprised. I didn't think it was going to make much difference. Of course, it's still not super powerful, but it's definitely more powerful than it was. I'm very impressed. Yeah, it's definitely running better, and the exhaust sounds so much louder than it did before. Obviously, this is not the performance we're looking for, though, so let's find that performance. And for that performance, we're going to turn to this HPI F4.6 Nitro 2-stroke engine. This thing's actually a little bit smaller displacement than the engine we had in the truck, but this is a 2-stroke engine, which means we're going to get double the combustion events, and this thing is specifically designed to power a big, heavy RC car. I think we're going to get some good performance out of this thing. The way most 2-stroke engines work is pretty fundamentally different from how a 4-stroke engine works. Let me get this cylinder head taken off, and I'll show you what the differences are. Now, as you can see here, there are no valves on the cylinder head, and there are no real valves at all in this engine. Instead, if you look down there, you can see there's a set of ports on both sides, and those ports are covered and uncovered by the piston, and that's what lets fresh air in and exhaust out. On a 2-stroke engine, the intake and compression cycles and the combustion and exhaust cycles are actually combined, which is why you can get a combustion event every single time the piston goes up. Unlike most 4-stroke engines, these small 2-stroke engines also don't have a piston ring that seals the piston against the cylinder. The cylinder actually tapers up here at the top, and you can see the piston pushes against it and actually pushes it out at the top. That's because this engine's brand new, which means we're gonna have to break this in, but first we need to get it in the truck. I'm hoping if we flip this exhaust around, we can put it where the other engine was so we can use the same slots I already made in the chassis in the previous video. In order to do that, we're gonna have to be able to use this motor mount. Let me go ahead and take some measurements off this new engine. We'll go ahead and put those into CAD and see just exactly what we'll have to do to the original motor mount in order to make it work. And as you can see here, we'd have to cut a big notch in the mount, which I don't think is a great idea, as it's going to make it pretty weak and our screws are going to have to be really short. So unfortunately, I don't think mounting it on this side is going to work, which means we're going to have to mount it over here, which means we got to strip this whole thing back down again. And now with all that stripped down, let's see if this thing's even gonna fit. It does look like it should mesh up with the center differential, and I think there's even gonna be clearance for the rear drive shaft, so yeah, I think we're in business. Again, we just need to take some measurements on this chassis, and then using the measurements I've already taken on the motor mount, go into CAD, take our model of the chassis, add the holes in where they're supposed to be, make those into slots, and then we can switch our Snapmaker Artisan over to laser cutting mode, cut this out in paper, and about 10 seconds later, we can actually test and see how it's gonna fit. This is where our new new slots will go, and fitting the motor over the top, it looks like it's going to be pretty close, though I think I need to scooch these slots over a little bit. So let me fix that in CAD, cut it out again, and we've got a paper template one more time. I'm telling you guys, that's the beauty of this laser cutter. You can iterate in prototyping so quickly. Putting this on here and dropping our center differential on, and then our motor. It looks like all this stuff's going to line up just about perfectly. And because there aren't very many square frames of reference on this chassis, we're going to use the exact same trick we did last time, where we're going to drill 3 holes that match the holes for the motor mount. Then we're going to screw the chassis down onto those holes which align it, and then we're going to go ahead and cut our slots. This chassis is starting to look like Swiss cheese, but these holes came out really, really well, and they're exactly where I wanted them to be. Kind of had to thread the needle here. I'm actually going to use a smaller screw and put a nut on the other side here, because if I'd made the slot the same size as these, it would have ended up either in this hole or in here. But now let's get this center differential on here and see if it actually fits. Not only does it fit, but those gears line up absolutely perfectly. Guys, I think this is actually gonna work. Let me get the throttle servo installed and do some wiring, and I'll show you what it looks like. Now, you might laugh at the fact that I double-side taped this throttle servo to the chassis, but they didn't call this kind of tape servo tape for nothing back in the day. A lot of servos used to be taped onto chassis, and especially for something like a throttle servo where there isn't really a lot of stress on it, this is gonna hold up just fine. I've also installed and wired up my receiver, and if we plug this in, you can see we've got throttle control now. Of course, controlling the fueling only works if we have fuel, and I think I'm going to use this fuel tank. The tank we were using before was really small, and I don't think we're going to get much runtime out of it. I think this will fit right here, and yeah, that should clear the front drive shaft. Now we just need to get the front and rear ends installed, and looks like we've got a clearance problem. In the previous video, I had to customize the mount for this rear brake servo because the engine was over here. Well, now the engine's over here, and it's in the way again. Unfortunately, I cut the mount off this side, so we're going to have to move this a different way. If you've never seen one of these before, it's a mechanical brake. When you engage the servo, it squeezes these 2 pads together and stops this rotor from spinning. The rotor is attached to the input, and that's what's going to give us our brakes. Well, fortunately, even though I did cut that bracket off, these 2 screw holes are still here. I think it's going to be plenty to hold this servo in, and that's going to clear everything just fine. All right, now we have throttle on one servo and brakes on the other servo. Some of you were wondering how I set this up, and on the G7P, it's fairly straightforward. Basically, I just set up a couple of mixes to where on channel 3, when I give it throttle, nothing happens, but when I give it brake, it activates that channel. You can see the M and S down here at the bottom. I'm getting the brake right now, and it's activating that channel. I'm hitting the throttle, and it's not doing anything. But then on mix 2, I have it set up to where if I give it throttle, I get that out on channel 4, but if I hit brake, nothing happens. Like I said, every transmitter is going to be different, and I'm actually going to be switching out my daily driver transmitter very soon. So if you want to see what I pick as a new daily driver and why, make sure you get subscribed, because it's going to be a pretty interesting video. I also did leave the front drive shaft out. I'm really curious to see how this thing handles 2-wheel drive. We'll probably end up putting it back in, assuming we have enough power out of the Nitro engine, but for now, I want to see what it can do with some slides, skids, and burnouts. Before we do that, of course, we need to break this brand new Nitro engine in. Now, there are about as many different Nitro break-in methods as there are Nitro engines, and there's a really good reason for that. There is no one single best way to break in a Nitro engine. The ultimate goal is just to keep the engine at a consistent temperature and well lubricated while the initial break-in occurs. And how long that break-in is going to take really depends on the engine, manufacturing tolerances, and a bunch of other things. What I like to do is just heat up the engine, get it started, idle it for a few tanks, letting it cool down between tanks, and then take it easy on the first couple tanks that you're driving it, and then go have fun. I'm going to be preheating with a heat gun, but you could use a hairdryer. It works just as well. And then once it's started, we're going to use an infrared thermometer to make sure it stays around 200 degrees Fahrenheit. Speaking of which, let's get this thing cranked up. Uh-oh. Well, that was unexpected. Unfortunately, this pole starter is actually broken. Now, I could take this apart and fix it, but I really don't want to, and I don't have a replacement pole starter. What I do have is a whole nother brand new engine. The good thing is swapping out these engines is actually very straightforward. There's not really much holding them in the car, and once I get that linkage removed, it's really just 4 screws, and we can go ahead and swap this over. Obviously, having the privilege of a whole spare engine means I don't have to go through the hassle of re-threading that pole starter, but of course, in most cases, that's probably what you would do. But I'm on a tight schedule, and that other engine is pretty much going to be the same thing as this one. They're about the same size and should make about the same power. Speaking of which, I don't know if I mentioned it, but these engines are rated to make about 3 horsepower, and that little 2-cylinder Semto engine that we had was rated at about a half a horsepower. So assuming we can get this to work properly, we're going to have about 6 times the power we had before. And now this should just pull right up out of here. We're going to need to swap over the exhaust. That's just held on by a spring. And we'll need to swap over this clutch, which should be fairly easy to take off, though they can be a little ornery sometimes. We'll see how this one goes. Well, fortunately, this one just fell right off, so this is a lot easier than it is sometimes to get these apart. And now we just need to install everything back on the new engine. And now finally stick the new engine back in the car, and I'll see you outside. All right, let's get this thing preheated and see if it'll start. We got the first couple tanks done on the bench. Let's see how this thing's gonna do on the ground. Remember, this thing's really, really rich, and I'm only gonna be going about a quarter throttle. Oh, okay, this has got so much more power than it had before. Like I said, this is just barely getting on it, and it's still way rich during break-in, and it's already kind of uncontrollable. So yeah, we're definitely gonna have to make this thing four-wheel drive. Know what we want to see, and that's that gorgeous red nitro head sticking out of the back of this Kraton EXB V6 body. Let's get to cutting. First things first, I'm just going to go ahead and cut a slit for the exhaust. Obviously, cutting up a beautiful body like this isn't for the faint of heart, but it's necessary for this project, so we're going to do it. And there we go, that's a good start, that looks awesome, but now of course comes the hard part, cutting the hole for the actual engine itself. What I'm going to do to make sure I get this in the right place is just take a tracing of the outside of the engine head. Now I'm going to cut that out. That's close enough. Now I'm going to take a piece of this double-sided tape, stick it to the paper, take the backing off, and then just lay it on top of the head pretty well centered. And now I'm going to put the body on top exactly where it's supposed to go. Now when I pull that back off again, the paper is stuck to the body and I know exactly where I need to cut to fit the engine. I'm going to go ahead and finish tracing this out and make the cut off camera. So let me do that and I'll bring you back and show you what it looks like. And there we go, guys. And now we just need to convert this thing over to four-wheel drive. I already put the front CVDs in, so we just need to put the front drive shaft in, which hopefully is going to clear this gas tank, and then we should be good to go. Instead of having a center differential in this truck, we just have a center spool. This was necessary in two-wheel drive so that we didn't lose all the energy through the front open part of the differential, and it's going to be necessary in four-wheel drive so that the brakes work in both the rear and in the front. There we go, that should give us a lot more traction to handle 6 times the power of that old engine. Now we need to address one more thing before we take this out for a blast. I noticed without any of the support, this chassis is very floppy. Unfortunately, we don't have room for the tower to chassis braces in the rear or in the front, but we should be able to do the tower to tower braces with just a little bit of modification. The front one installs no problem, everything clears, but unfortunately the rear one interferes with the cooling head on the engine. I think we can get around this just by mounting it to the outside of the middle here. Obviously the best solution would be to mill some of the cooling fins off the engine, but that's going to reduce cooling and I really don't want to do that, so let's see if this works first. Yeah, I think this is going to work, and whereas this probably isn't quite as strong as it was originally, it certainly prevents the chassis from feeling completely floppy and should prevent these gears from stripping out when we land a jump, which hopefully we're going to go do right now. Alright guys, let's see what she can do. Now keep in mind, I'm still running the break-in process on this, so it's very rich, but as you can see, we have got plenty of power now. This thing is a lot of fun already. Yeah guys, this is what a Nitro RC car is supposed to be like. And this thing has a ton of jam. Obviously, again, this is not going to be as powerful as something like a modern brushless system. You're just never going to get that out of a Nitro engine. But as you can see, it's plenty powerful enough. And this easily feels like 6 times as much power as we had before, which is what they said it was going to be, so I'm not surprised. Yeah, this is fun. The beauty of this is the Kraton platform is going to be a lot more durable than pretty much any other Nitro platform you can get. So this thing is not only nice and powerful and a lot of fun, but it's going to be stronger than most other Nitros, if not all other Nitros out there. Let's see if it'll do a big jump. Oh yeah! Oh, let's do that again. And of course you get the wonderful Nitro smell and sound. Brakes work. Oh yeah, brakes work really well. Let's try that. Oh yeah, we can lock up the wheels, so that's great. Yeah guys, this is an absolute blast, and I think I'm going to be keeping this setup around for a while. Arrma definitely should make a Nitro version of the Kraton because this is really, really good. And again, like I said, keep in mind, this thing is just barely tuned up. It's still running super rich because it's still in its break-in process. So we've got a lot more performance we're leaving on the table that we'll be able to get later on once it's fully broken in. But I think you'll agree that right now it's got plenty of jam. So there we go, guys. I think that sufficiently scratches the Nitro power itch. And like I said out there, this engine is just barely getting broken in. It's still being run really rich. We probably have another 30% power available once it's fully broken in. These brakes actually worked better than I expected them to. And even though we don't have a center differential in here, the thing handled just fine. Overall, I'm extremely happy with how this project came out, but let me know down in the comments what you think about it. What would you change? What would you keep the same? Do you want to see an official Nitro Kraton come from Arrma? Drop your thoughts down in the comments. Make sure you get subscribed for more awesome projects, and I'll see you in the next one.